The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
A look at the state of Black America tells two very different tales: unparalleled successes and growing poverty. How did such a dichotomy occur? Today we discuss the intersection of race and economics with Glenn Loury, Professor of Economics at Brown University and the author of The Anatomy of Racial Inequality. And now, Doug Besheroff.
Glenn Loury. Welcome back to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Thank you, Doug.
In our last show, we talked about problems facing the African American community. We talked a little bit about Jim Crow. We didn't talk about what you've written about, which is self-confirming racial stereotypes.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So in this book, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality,
that's my cue.
I try to make a theoretical argument about why racial inequality might be so stubborn. And one aspect of that argument is it turns on the fact that race is a special kind of category in that you can see at a glance what group somebody belongs to. It's information that's carried on the body itself. Marks on the body have social significance. I use that kind of language. So people take notice. People take notice if someone moves into the neighborhood and they look different. People take notice if someone's walking toward them down the street and they look different. If someone gets into their taxi cab and they look different, they take notice. Okay? Now, though they may know nothing else, they know that the person belongs to this group. And by belonging to this group, generalizations can be made. Okay? You can make a surmise. You can draw a conclusion. The conclusion could be totally incorrect. It just might be nonsense. Or it might be correct on the average, but not correct about this particular person. So here's someone with a criminal record who's an African American, and he's 22 years old, and he's male, and he comes into your workplace, and he wants to be a stock boy, and you're worried, is he going to steal from you? Is he going to be reliable? Is he going to talk back? Is he going to work well with the others? And you form a generalization based upon what you might know about that category that might not be true about this guy.
Which is often not true about this guy, but I bite my tongue as I say it. Can often be true.
It can be true about the guy. It may be true on the average about guys like that.
I mean, Jesse Jackson legitimated a line of discourse when he said, walking down the street, I hear some steps behind me and I turn around and it's three men carrying Bibles and I'm much more relaxed, right?
Yeah. The point about self-confirming, though, is important in my argument. What I've just been talking about is stereotype, the idea that you form a generalization about a group of people based on something superficial, like the color of their skin, or their skin color and their age and their sex. But it might be self-confirming, because suppose you're one of these kids who did get into trouble, who paid his dues, is out, and is now looking for a job at 22, and you go from one employer to the other, and you get turned down by somebody who looks at you and basically says, nah, I'd rather take a chance on the foreigner than to take a chance on you. That just might piss you off. That just might cause you to be dispirited. That just might make you angry. That might cause you to disengage from the system of effort and entrepreneurship and hard work that causes people to get ahead. A whole community of people might be influenced by experiences of that kind. And that then might feed back to cause their behaviors to conform more with the stereotypic presumption. Okay? So that's the kind of idea that I'm trying to capture. Not to say that this is some pat explanation of anything, just to say that it's a social dynamic. It's a process of which we would be better off to be aware and to bear in mind, and that is peculiar to the racial markings, right? The fact that the person is defined, at least in many social settings, by something as superficial as the color of his skin can have this adverse impact. That's the thing I'm trying to argue.
Yeah, I think I agree. I was going to say I think that's right. I certainly agree. But I'm wondering whether it is the case now mainly for race, because the other differences that were so large in the American past have largely disappeared. You might have said that about Jews 50 or 75 years ago. You might have said it about, whatever. And it's the differences, the differences were very large within the American population, at least were perceived that way a while ago, and they've sort of disappeared. And we still see it for race, partly for the physical marker that you're talking about.
Yeah, so the race studies people at this point would start talking about the construction of whiteness. And because I'm an economist, I don't usually talk about the social construction of whiteness. But I think this does have to be said, which is that many of those differences that were so sharp in the minds of Americans when huge immigrations from Europe were taking place at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, many of those differences associated with religion and with ethnicity washed away over the course of the 20th century as the Jews and the Italians and the Irish and the Polish became white. Now, in saying that, I know a Jewish person might well say, "What do you mean?" I'm not saying that there aren't distinctivenesses. There isn't anything distinctive. But what I'm saying, though, is that there was a way to be more fully American if your skin wasn't black in the middle of the 20th century. The historian Thomas Segru, studying Detroit in the years during and after the Second World War, talks about what was largely a Slavic immigrant community in Detroit, a working class community, people who were not, the streets weren't paved with gold. They were struggling to maintain a little decent place to live and so forth. Blacks begin to migrate into Detroit in the 1940s, and their definition of the government doing right by them is in effect protecting them and their communities from labor competition from the blacks, for competition for housing from the blacks. In a sense, they said, you're not really living up to your promise, Democratic Party, of delivering a New Deal if you don't protect us from those people. They understood becoming American as getting enough up the rungs of the ladder. They knew where the bottom of the ladder was, and they knew what color it was. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that historically, the fact of black racial subordination and second-class status in the society has also, in a way, been a kind of springboard that has facilitated the diminution of the ethnic differences amongst white Americans as the blacks stand as some kind of symbolic opposition, some kind of other against which one can define one's Americanness.
Boy, don't you think...
Is that a mouthful?
I think you could be right. I also just see the second and the third generation and dating, and they all go to the same schools, and they all go to the same colleges or whatever.
Well, that's part of what I'm talking about. Intermarriage. Part of what I'm talking about is intermarriage between these various ethnic groups, so that now being Jewish or being Italian or being Irish isn't such an insular thing, because within the family maybe we've gotten across the line.
Or being Asian.
And now being Asian, and there's quite a bit of intermarriage between Asians and white Americans.
So you think, we should get off this topic real soon before I get in trouble, but there is a great deal of pressure on black women, right, to be loyal to the race, and not an equivalent amount of pressure on black men.
I don't know if that's true. I don't know. It may be true. I just don't know. And if the pressure is there, I'm not sure where it's coming from. It may be internally imposed. I just don't know. I do know this. Bill Cosby, the actor, comedian, philanthropist, he's a friend of Spelman College, the historically black women's college in Atlanta. And he gave a commencement address there recently, in which he said to the women at Spelman, he said, basically, he said, listen, you guys, the men, they're in jail, they're not doing very well, their college going rates are much lower than yours and so forth. You have a lot of burden on your shoulders. You got to carry the weight for our people. And when he said that, the thought that crossed my mind was, well, Bill Cosby, you stopped short of the obvious implication, which is marry a white guy. Why didn't you say that, Bill Cosby? Why didn't you tell those women at Spelman College to go for themselves? Well, we kind of know why. He would have gotten lynched if he had said that at Spelman College.
Right.
And he would have lost his credibility with African Americans if he had said that. And I'm not saying it now. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. Obviously, it does matter. But I'm saying it's really, really complicated. And I'm also saying that when that barrier falls, as I think that it will, I think that it's going to be a very rapid shift. I mean, my sense is that there's a norm. I don't know where you say pressure. I don't believe there's anybody up there on top pulling strings. I mean, it's not a conspiracy, but it's a social outcome. It's a norm. But when the norm begins to erode, I think it's going to just completely collapse.
Well, this is like tipping point.
Yeah.
You made mention of it, and we should mention it for the audience. I think it's something like 60 to 65% of the black college graduates every year are women, which means it's almost 2 to 1.
I don't know the number offhand, but I'm not surprised at that. It's 60% of the SAT test takers. It's 2 and 3 to 1 at many of the elite colleges in the enrollments. And if you figure that women are graduating at a higher rate than the men are, and they're enrolling at a higher rate, it could well be 2/3 of the black college graduates are women.
And the other thing that economists talk about, is a sort of mating, which is to say it becomes unusual for a female college graduate to marry someone who's just a high school graduate. So this could be one of the forces.
No doubt this is a force that's at play, and in fact you could ask the question, why hasn't the dam broken yet, given the extent of these forces that are at play? And that's an interesting sort of social psychological question.
Part of this, and you alluded to it, is a sense of them and us. Expand on that a little bit.
Well, what I'm saying there is that, like I said these people in the inner cities are our people. They're our kids. Okay? There are kids sometimes really messed up. There are kids who've sometimes done really terrible things. Think about criminal justice issues. But they're still our kids. Okay? That notion that what's happening in inner city America is happening to us, to our kids, to people like us, there but for the grace of God go I, is not broadly enough held in the land, in my view. Rather, it becomes easier to say, and in the heat of partisan politics, it sometimes becomes necessary, some politicians think, to say, we are our people out here, we're going to get taken care of, and those are those people over there, and we're going to keep ourselves protected from them. It's not our problem, it's them, not us. Now, of course, a respectable politician doesn't today say that explicitly and literally, but when a respectable politician runs a Willie Horton ad...
This is Al Gore.
No.
The first Willie Horton ad was an Al Gore.
Oh, I just learned something.
Yeah. It's okay. It's
well,
okay.
Al Gore didn't get elected president,
yeah.
And the other guy did.
Yeah.
That guy's name was George Herbert Walker Bush.
Right.
That campaign was 1988.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of fair-minded people agree that use of the prison furlough program in a political ad with a figure, Willie Horton, who was an African-American man, led out by Michael Dukakis, although Michael Dukakis was not personally responsible for that program in any case, who then committed a crime. They thought that a race card was being played there. They also thought that when President Ronald Reagan talked about welfare queens, or when his speechwriter did, that they knew what they were doing and that they were playing an us-them race card there. And this African-American thinks there might be something to that.
Well, let me take your point to something else you've written about, which is colorblind versus color-neutral policies or evaluation. And you've been touching on that. Here, you're in effect saying we should look to see whether our policies have some kind of disproportionate effect on either people of color or severely disadvantaged people of color. Because part of what you're talking about are the people who have been the most unlucky in our society, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And what I mean by that is, so there's all this controversy about affirmative action, and so then there are people who say we should be a colorblind society. And what I say is, well, perhaps we could argue it case by case. I'm not sure I'm persuaded about that. But that's not really the most important question. The most important question is not whether or not we are blind to race. The most important question is whether we're indifferent to racial inequality, because there are lots of things that we can do universally, that is to say, we can do for everybody regardless of their color, that will either have beneficial consequences at reducing racial inequality or will have really devastating negative consequences in terms of racial inequality. I take the war on drugs to be one of them. Now, again, I don't want to be misunderstood. Okay? A policy that says drug use is bad for the country and we want to discourage it, that's a good policy. A policy that tries to pursue that goal by demonizing the retail trafficking in drugs, by establishing mandatory minimum sentences and criminal justice policies that have a very substantial, disparate, negative hit on the African American and Latino and urban poor minority communities. That's a policy that might be questioned. We might ask, okay, we have a goal. What are going to be the cost of pursuing that goal? And we pursue the goal in the colorblind means, as is to say, the laws apply the same way to everybody. There's no racial preference or discrimination, let me suppose. Still, if pursuing the goal in a certain way has these negative costs for a disadvantaged group, we might think twice about whether or not we want to go that way. But in fact, just the opposite has happened, and this is what I mean by the way that race comes in. In fact, it becomes possible to build a career on the kind of subtextual message that I'm going to keep you safe from them.
Without disagreeing with you too much.
It's okay.
I'll give you another example, though,
Yeah.
of precisely the process you're describing that I don't think is them, and I largely agree with what you're saying. And this is in the area of child support enforcement and proposals that have been made for the last few years, including most recently on the pages of the New York Times, to require the unwed fathers, right, of children, if they're not paying child support, to be required to be in some public service. And when I ask what happens when the fathers don't want to be in this public service, and I've asked this of senior people in the Democratic leadership in the Congress who are pushing bills like this, and I say, you know, in the end, it'll be another reason to lock up black men.
Yeah.
Right? This is what you're talking about.
Yeah, it is.
Look to see the impact. And there's a blank face. Now, I don't think there'll be a politician, a Republican or whatever, running for president saying, here's this symbolic crusade, we're going to go after deadbeat dads, and you know, they're black, so we're really going to get them. I think there are other forces that are pushing this idea, and they are blind to the racial impact. And the blindness is as powerful as wanting to manipulate the racial impact.
Yeah, but you see, this blindness or this indifference, this failure to take into account, this moving straight ahead without being bothered by this, is very telling, because we're not always blind. In other words, if the effect of the policy was going to be to make corn farmers poor, even though that was nobody's intent,
never happened.
It wouldn't happen. If the impact of the policy was going to be a negative hit on the elderly, even though the policy might otherwise be perfectly a reasonable thing to do, we might well think twice about it. You know what I mean? So a constituency that's organized and that's vocal and that has representatives and that is taken seriously, somehow we're not blind to the detrimental consequences of something that might not have been intentionally harmful, but that nevertheless could get done. But this constituency, these people, and again, it's worse, I think, almost than simply that we don't see. It's that some of the power of the expressive benefit from the action. So what is deadbeat dads? I mean, deadbeat dad is both a policy, and it's a way of saying what's the difference between right and wrong. It's a way of announcing what we stand for. It's a way of expressing our values, right? And some of the power of that expressive dimension comes from the fact that the people who are going to be on the other side of this look like them and not like us. I can't prove that, but that's my conviction, that's my sense.
We are today, putting aside whether Barack Obama or Colin Powell or whoever becomes president, at what I think is
Well,
probably...
we know it's not going to be Colin Powell.
Stranger things have happened.
Okay, but I can't think of any.
Rudy Giuliani in drag.
Okay, you got me. Okay.
Being elected, winning the Republican primaries, no less. But seriously, putting that aside, at least for the foreseeable future, we are at the high point of African American political power in the Congress. When people like Charles Rangel retire, as you have alluded to, his replacement will be a Hispanic. And it's true for, I think, 6 or 10 of the 30 or 40 members of the Black Caucus. If not them, who? And what's the long-term political structure of this debate? Not the social. Where is this?
This is a very interesting question. I hadn't actually thought about the fact that these 25-year veterans of the House of Representatives, when they step down, their districts are probably more Hispanic than they are Black, and so forth. I hadn't thought about that, but that's probably right. And more generally, I mean, Barack Obama, you mentioned, and he's an attractive candidate, everybody says. He's a little green for my taste, I must say. We are talking, after all, about the presidency of the United States, and we do have a little experience about what can go wrong when that job's not done well. But yeah, Black political voice had better find a way of getting hooked up to, I don't know what it's going to be, progressive political voice or minority political voice or something. It's got to diversify. We got to diversify now. We got to form coalitions across these lines, whatever the shape or the form of them. And I expect that this is something that needs to be worked out locally. I don't see it happening. I'm not an expert on politics, but I don't see it happening. I see people, circling the wagons. You know what I mean? They see the Hispanics coming over the horizon and they say, no, 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 no. They fight, they fight, they fight. They're going to lose that fight. Yeah. So they better find a different way of defining the problem.
One last question. You've been through a lot in your life. I won't even ask you your age. If you met a young boy with your promise in the inner city tomorrow, 12 years old, what would your advice to him be? Or her?
Get into a good school and get yourself an education. Now, if there's not a charter school in that town, if there's not an exam school that you can kind of get yourself into because you're a talented and you're a gifted kid, you know what I'm saying? We're going to have to find a way to pay the tuition someplace, because get yourself into an environment that is going to develop your skills. That's the only way. The problem is a problem of development. You've got the potential, okay? That's what I tell them.
I think that's a good way to end. Glenn Loury, on behalf of the University of Maryland, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Doug.
And now I'm delighted to turn to our audience for questions, and if you'd like, introduce yourself as you ask your question.
Hi, my name is Nora Ashrati, and I was wondering if you could speak to the charter school phenomenon just briefly, and whether you see that as sort of a permanent and almost the future of education, or if it's something that's sort of along the way, a step to actual public school reform.
Well, my comment, yes, I can speak to it. I'm not an expert on education or education policy. I can't pretend to that. My comment was motivated, frankly, by my daughter, my firstborn, born March 1967. I've just given her age out to everybody, and mine too. My daughter moved out of Chicago and now lives in suburban Maryland, just outside of the district. And when she was in the city of Chicago with her two children, 8 and 11 years old, I can't tell you how much work it was for her to find a decent place to send those kids to school. She managed to find a place. The woman was driving. She'd drive 30 miles to the other side of town at rush hour to drop her kids off and pick them up for a while. This is what she was doing because she was simply trying to find, if she had sent the kid to the place that the kid would automatically go if the parent didn't pay any attention, the place just was not providing an adequate education, and she wanted more for her children, and she couldn't afford to send them to any place else. So she had to work the system very well to get her kid into the right school. So when I said charter school, what I meant to say was, in her case, it was a charter school. I meant to say innovations in education that are producing for people in the cities with modest means really excellent educational opportunity. I'm simply not competent to answer the question of whether or not the charter school movement is going to be here 25 years from now doing that. We all know about the debate about vouchers. We all know about the turmoil that's going on in education. The institutions are not effectively educating the children who depend on them. Those children are not the property of anybody, including the people whose livelihood may depend upon the current structure. Whatever works, that's all I'm interested in.
Whatever works. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Glenn Loury. And again, for Policy Watch from the University of Maryland.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.